more than dozens of armored vehicles damaged or left burning, and hundreds of Russian soldiers forced to scatter on foot have been recorded in recent frontline engagements. Yet the most alarming detail is not the wreckage itself. Even after reaching abandoned houses, collapsed ruins, basements, and makeshift shelters, many Russian soldiers are still being hunted down and eliminated one by FPV drones. On the battlefield in Ukraine, hiding no longer equals safety. In recent clashes, Russian forces have continued to rely on convoys made up of tanks, APCs, and support vehicles to move troops toward areas filled with abandoned houses and field fortifications. However, the growing density of FPV drones has turned roads, houses, and ruins into exposed targets rather than protection. Once a position is detected, surveillance does not stop. Tracking continues as soldiers abandon vehicles, run into tree lines, and disappear inside damaged buildings. The strike often comes later, not immediately, when movement slows and anxiety appears. This is not chaos. It is a methodical system that watches, waits, and attacks at the moment targets believe they have survived. The result is a battlefield where traditional ideas of cover, armor, and retreat are breaking down in real time. The key question now is how FPV drones have made even walls and armored vehicles unreliable, and why tanks and APCs are no longer enough to protect the soldiers moving behind them. The Russian convoy moved with confidence because armored vehicles still shape how ground forces expect protection to work. Tanks rolled at the front as moving shields. APCs followed with infantry inside, and support trucks carried fuel, ammunition, and supplies meant to sustain the next phase of fighting. This formation reflected a familiar belief that steel, weight, and firepower could still secure movement across contested ground. The objective was clear and limited in scope, because the convoy was not racing for a breakthrough, but heading toward a cluster of abandoned houses and field fortifications, chosen as a temporary assembly point. Such locations had been used before as places to reorganize, redistribute supplies, and prepare troops for further tasks closer to the line. What the crews inside the vehicles could not see was that the convoy had already been identified long before it reached that destination. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones detected the movement early and followed it quietly, staying high enough to avoid reaction, but close enough to map the entire formation. There was no immediate strike, no rush to engage, and no attempt to disrupt the lead tank at first contact. Instead, the drone presence focused on understanding timing, spacing, and direction, because information mattered more than speed at this stage. Each vehicle became a tracked element, and each turn of the road narrowed the choices available to the convoy without anyone inside realizing it. From above, the weaknesses were visible even if the armor below felt secure. The convoy depended on the road to maintain order, yet that same road fixed its movement and limited its ability to react if something went wrong. Tanks at the front could fire and intimidate, but they could not easily reverse direction, and APCs in the middle had little room to maneuver once compressed by terrain. Support vehicles at the rear carried the lifeline of the formation, but they lacked the protection needed to survive sudden contact. The decision by Ukrainian operators to keep watching rather than striking immediately shaped everything that followed. By holding fire, the drones allowed the convoy to stretch, settle, and commit fully to its route toward the houses. This patience removed the option of a quick retreat, because turning back later would require time and coordination that armored columns struggle to achieve under stress. That sense of control was critical, because it encouraged the formation to press forward instead of dispersing or slowing down. From the air, the situation unfolded differently, because as the convoy neared the abandoned houses, vehicle spacing tightened and movement became constrained by terrain and damaged road sections. By delaying the first strike, the drones allowed the convoy to advance deeper into the area, where close spacing, restricted routes, and reduced mobility made it harder for tanks and APCs to screen the vehicles moving behind them. What appeared to be a routine movement toward shelter was already turning into a controlled setup, where protection relied on assumptions that no longer matched the reality above the road. The moment the FPV drone struck, the convoy shifted from movement to survival within seconds. The first hits set the target on the lead and last tank in a dramatic duel, because the intent was not to win a direct exchange, but to lock the entire formation in place. FPV drones went after an APC near the front and a support vehicle closer to the middle, creating sudden fire and thick smoke that cut visual contact between vehicles. One explosion tore through the side of an APC and forced infantry inside to abandon it immediately, while another blast set a fuel truck burning and blocked the narrow road behind it. Flames and debris turned the route into a choke point, and the vehicles following had no clear path forward or backward. As panic spread, Russian crews reacted with instinct rather than coordination. Tank turrets swung toward the sky and fired high explosive rounds into tree lines and open ground, hoping to scare off drones that were already gone. Machine guns rattled from hatches as gunners searched for targets they could not see, filling the air with noise but not solving the problem. The sound of engines revving mixed with gunfire and shouted commands, yet the formation no longer moved as one unit. FPV drones returned in waves, striking again before crews could regain control. Another APC closer to the head of the convoy was hit and stopped dead, sealing the front while burning wrecks sealed the rear. This was the critical effect, because the convoy was now trapped between damaged vehicles with no room to turn around. Tanks in the middle tried to reverse, but armored vehicles are slow to change direction on narrow roads, especially when smoke hides obstacles and wounded vehicles block the path. Inside several vehicles, infantry made quick choices under pressure. Some jumped out the moment the doors opened, choosing open ground over burning steel. Others stayed inside for seconds longer, hoping the armor would still protect them, until heat and smoke forced them out. Once outside, the road offered no safety, because the same open space that allowed escape also made every movement visible from above. FPV drones exploited this confusion with precision. They did not chase every soldier at once, but focused on keeping vehicles disabled and separated. Each new strike increased hesitation among the remaining drivers, who slowed down or stopped entirely, unsure whether moving would make them safer or deadlier targets. The convoy lost its rhythm, which is fatal for armored movement. Without speed and spacing, tanks could no longer screen APCs, and APCs could no longer protect supply trucks. The structure that had given the convoy confidence only minutes earlier collapsed into isolated vehicles and scattered groups of men. Middle vehicles were hit hardest by this design. They could not push forward because wrecks blocked the road, and they could not pull back without exposing weaker sides or rear sections. By striking selected vehicles instead of everything at once, FPV drones achieved something larger than destruction. The road that once guided the convoy now trapped it, and the armored shield that promised safety became a series of burning obstacles that split the formation into pieces. The first successful strikes against the convoy broke its structure and immediately changed the nature of the engagement. Once several vehicles were disabled and the road was blocked by fire and wreckage, the Russian formation no longer functioned as a single unit. Groups of soldiers separated based on proximity and opportunity rather than command direction. At that point, movement decisions became individual and reactive. A number of soldiers moved toward the forest edge near the road, choosing terrain that appeared complex and visually dense. Trees were used as physical reference points, with soldiers positioning themselves close to trunks or between overlapping branches. This approach relied on the assumption that broken outlines and vertical cover would complicate aerial tracking. FPV drones adjusted altitude and angle to maintain visual contact, then executed strikes once movement slowed near those trees. In several cases, drones approached from offset directions rather than directly above, allowing the strike to land beside or behind cover. The tree itself remained intact, but the exposed area around it absorbed the blast, neutralizing the target without requiring direct contact. Other soldiers selected disabled armored vehicles as shelter, particularly abandoned tanks that had already been hit earlier in the engagement. They moved beneath hulls or between tracks and ground, using mass and shadow as concealment. FPV drones responded by descending to lower altitude and entering the space beneath the vehicle from the side. Detonations under the chassis produced confined blast effects, turning the vehicle into a fixed reference point rather than protection. This method removed targets without engaging the armor itself. While these actions unfolded near the road, additional soldiers moved away from the forest and toward nearby houses and ruins that had been identified earlier as a temporary assembly area. Movement toward buildings followed predictable routes across open yards and damaged fences. Once inside the structures, soldiers occupied basements, collapsed rooms, or ground-level spaces shielded by remaining walls. These positions were selected based on physical coverage rather than tactical coordination. During this phase, FPV drones did not immediately strike. Instead, they maintained distance and followed movement paths from above, recording entry points and final positions. This delay reduced the risk of targets relocating again and allowed operators to confirm that movement had ended. Once soldiers remained stationary within trees, under vehicles, or inside buildings, their positions became fixed elements on the battlefield. From that point forward, tracking no longer required continuous pursuit. Each hiding location had already been confirmed. The engagement shifted from movement interdiction to position elimination. Forest cover, armored wrecks, and buildings no longer represented unknown variables but marked locations awaiting follow-on action. The dispersion of soldiers across different forms of cover created multiple isolated engagements rather than a single battle. No group could support another, and no movement occurred that would restore cohesion. The choice to flee into terrain or structures did not remove the threat. It only changed the environment in which the next stage of the operation would occur. By forcing the convoy to fragment, FPV drones transformed a linear engagement into a controlled sequence of isolated targets. Each decision made by fleeing soldiers reduced mobility and increased predictability. What followed was no longer a pursuit, but a systematic transition toward fixed position engagement, shaped by earlier tracking rather than immediate reaction. Once Russian soldiers reached buildings and underground spaces, the engagement did not end, but it slowed into a different phase. FPV drones no longer needed to chase movement across open ground. Their task shifted to following soldiers until each one reached what appeared to be a final stopping point. Most of these positions were basements beneath damaged houses, or rooms inside abandoned structures. Some soldiers entered through broken doors and windows, while others climbed down through holes created by earlier shelling. From above, these entry paths were easy to track. Drones stayed at distance and kept visual contact with the building rather than attacking right away. The reason was simple. As long as movement continued inside the structure, the position was not fixed. The strike came only after movement stopped, and no further relocation was observed. In one case, several soldiers moved into the basement of a two-story house with a collapsed upper floor. They entered through a side opening and remained below ground. The FPV drone circled above the roofline and waited. After a short period with no visible movement around entrances or exits, the drone descended through a broken window frame and detonated inside. The blast traveled through the enclosed space and caused the damaged roof above to collapse inward. In another case, soldiers entered a single-level abandoned building with parts of the roof already missing. They took cover in separate rooms, using remaining walls for separation. The FPV drone approached from above and entered through the open roof section rather than a doorway. The explosion occurred inside the structure and sent debris outward, collapsing internal walls and sealing off exits. What had looked like solid cover from the ground became a confined trap once the strike happened. Another case showed soldiers using a shallow underground space near a ruined house. The dugout had a narrow entrance and was covered with loose material. The FPV drone did not attack while soldiers were entering. It waited until there was no further movement at the opening. Once confirmed, the drone descended directly into the entrance and detonated. The confined space amplified the blast and caused the surrounding earth to fall inward. In another place, soldiers entered a partially destroyed house where one wall had collapsed outward. They positioned themselves along the remaining interior wall, believing the open side reduced the risk of being trapped. The FPV drone approached from the exposed side and detonated inside the room rather than striking the wall itself. The blast reflected off the remaining structure and filled the interior space, leaving no clear escape path. In each of these situations, the pattern was consistent. The drone did not rush the attack. It waited until soldiers believed they had escaped danger and stopped repositioning. Only then did the strike occur. This timing reduced the chance of escape and limited the need for repeated engagement. Houses and ruins no longer functioned as shelter. They became fixed locations that limited Russian soldiers' movement and escape. What mattered was not the strength of the building, but the fact that it trapped those inside. From the air, each structure became a closed container rather than a defensive position. By the time the attack came, options were already gone. Exits were limited, and the drone needed only a single entry to complete the task. This phase showed that reaching a building did not mean reaching safety. It marked the moment when pursuit ended and elimination began. The aftermath of the strikes did not bring calm, because the FPV drones continued working through the area with the same steady rhythm. After the houses and basements were hit, the drones shifted outward and began checking nearby ground where temporary shelters were likely to exist. Shallow dugouts, scraped trenches, and improvised covers were identified one by one as heat and movement betrayed their presence. Each suspected position was approached carefully, and once confirmed, it was struck in quick succession, leaving little time for anyone inside to escape. This process unfolded across the area until no place remained where soldiers could gather or reorganize without being seen. As the ground was cleared, the situation for wounded soldiers grew more uncertain. Those with light injuries who had survived the earlier phases often tried to remain hidden and wait for evacuation that never arrived. Some attempted to move towards safer rear positions, but movement itself drew attention and triggered renewed tracking. Others stayed where they were, conserving strength, only to be detected later when body heat rose against the cooling surroundings. For those eventually recovered by their units, treatment was brief and functional, because the pressure on manpower left little room for rest. After short care, many were sent back toward the front, returning to the same environment that had already exposed them once. The cycle continued without pause, and the battlefield did not reset between engagements. During this phase, isolated acts of resistance appeared. A few soldiers fired upward when they heard the buzz of a drone, and in some cases a machine was hit and fell. The sound of gunfire and the sudden movement marked exact positions that had been concealed moments earlier. Within a short time, other drones arrived and focused on those spots, because the exchange had provided clear guidance from below. What felt like a small success quickly turned into a signal flare that invited renewed attention. Each attempt to fight back narrowed options rather than expanding them. As these events unfolded, armored vehicles remained present but ineffective. Tanks that were still operational held their positions or shifted slowly, unable to advance into areas already saturated with drone activity. APCs waited behind cover, hesitant to move infantry forward when the ground ahead had already been exposed. Without cohesive infantry support, armor became isolated, watching rather than shaping the fight. The vehicles that once defined the formation could not restore order after soldiers had been scattered and revealed. The ground around the original convoy route transformed into a patchwork of cleared zones where no stable defense could take hold. Each shelter that was destroyed forced survivors to move again, and each movement reduced the chance of remaining unseen. There was no line to hold and no position to reinforce, only a series of temporary pauses that ended in renewed contact. The engagement stretched over time rather than space, as drones revisited areas repeatedly to confirm nothing remained. By the end, the battlefield showed no clear front, only silence broken by distant engines and occasional fire. What remained were damaged vehicles, collapsed shelters, and empty ground where soldiers had tried to stand their ground. The FPV drones withdrew only after movement ceased across the area, leaving behind a zone where defense had dissolved into individual survival attempts. The convoy that once relied on tanks and APCs no longer existed as a fighting unit. Its remnants were scattered, exposed, and unable to regroup, while the terrain offered no reliable place to recover or reorganize. The sequence ended not with a decisive clash between forces, but with the steady removal of every option that could support a stable defense. What unfolded in this engagement sends a clear warning, because the fighting did not end when the convoy stopped moving, or when soldiers reached walls and roofs. The sequence showed that modern combat in Ukraine no longer offers temporary safety. Houses, ruins, basements, and field shelters failed to protect once FPV drones controlled the low sky. Armored vehicles could move troops forward, but they could not shield them once formations broke and movement slowed. This is no longer a battlefield where cover buys time or where retreat guarantees survival. It is a space where visibility matters more than armor and where pause becomes risk. The larger question now reaches far beyond this single fight. Can modern armies adapt fast enough to protect infantry when drones can see through trees, walls, and earth? Or will forces continue to lose men and vehicles to systems that are cheap, precise, and easy to replace? The next phase of this war could be shaped less by who holds ground and more by who controls the air closest to it. That reality is still forming, and its limits are not yet clear. So what comes next? Is there a reliable defense against FPV drones? Or is this the beginning of a long shift in how wars are fought? Share your view in the comments. If this kind of clear battlefield analysis matters, like the video, share it, and subscribe to Military Force for more updates that go beyond the headlines.